So it's showing you that there is a relationship between what we define as devil and the 10%. And that's important to understand, because when we're talking about the 10%, utilizing the labor of the masses of people to enrich themselves, we're talking about capitalism, more specifically crony capitalism. And a lot of times living in this society, people are raised to admire the 10% and to emulate the 10%, not really looking at them as what they're doing is devilish. There's nothing good about that, right? So it's important to see that there is a connection or relationship between what we define as devil or adversarial and what the 10% actually represent. One of the other things that you'll notice in that lesson is it talks about how God is really concealed by the 10%, and they keep the 85% worshiping that which they cannot see, invisible. Invisible is a compound word. It has two words in it, invisible. So anything that we see as invisible is really in the visible. That's one reason why I named that book about the secret societies Eyes Wide Shut, because a lot of this stuff is right in front of your face. It's in the visible. But one of the things that the lesson is telling you is that the 85%, they see and they know that it rains, hell, snows. They recognize what's visible, but they just don't want you to teach them. It's the same thing with some of you who have children. They may just take for granted what you got to say, and somebody come along and say the exact same thing that you said, and they'd be like, oh, yeah. Same thing with some people that y'all know. You might have been telling them some shit for a long time. As soon as somebody else come along, now they act like they have an epiphany or something, and they understand it. So sometimes people just don't want to hear some shit from you. So the reason why I'm showing you this about cognitive dissonance is because when that lesson speaks about how the 85% knows that it rains, hell, snows, and also hears thunder above their heads, but do not try to learn who is causing all this to happen by letting the 5% teach them, that is oftentimes because they're in a state of cognitive dissonance. Keep in mind, we live in a society that is based upon belief systems. Not knowledge, not what you know, not what you've investigated, what you believe and what you feel. And because of that, if you are becoming a scientist of life, and a lot of times what you know conflicts with what people believe. So the more that you know, the more that you are experiencing, the more of a conflict you may become to other people. So sometimes people don't want to hear what you got to say just simply because it conflicts with what they believe. Just like the lesson says, they believe the 10% on face value. Because if the 10% of those who are in authority in terms of dominating the resources, the institutions, and the economy, enriching themselves relies upon people's belief. That's how capitalism works. Because if people had the know-how and the capacity to do for themselves, they would not have to rely on others to do it for them. So ignorance benefits the society in terms of the way capitalism functions. A person that has knowledge becomes a threat, right? And just like what he was explaining, cognitive dissonance is when a person is entertaining conflicting thoughts. So the same way that we're talking about what devil would be from the worldview of us, or that would be adversarial to us having knowledge of self and the ability to control our own destiny, they look at the shit in reverse. They may look at us as adversarial or a threat to their belief system. So when a person experiences that internal cognitive dissonance or that uncomfortability, they do things in order to find some sense of comfort, like what he was talking about. He was talking about the psychological aspect of cognitive dissonance, meaning the self-talk that a person goes through when they're confronted with something that is the opposite or the opposing thought of what it is they believe. So in their own heads, they do exactly what he was saying. They may minimize it or trivialize it and say, well, yeah, whatever. Or they may attack that with more of their beliefs. So for example, if a person is, they have a certain religion and they're confronted with an experience that conflicts with their religion or their belief, they do exactly what he was talking about. They add more thoughts. They may rifle through a bunch of scriptures in their head to try to justify why what they looking at ain't what it is, right? The goal when a person is experiencing cognitive dissonance internally is to find some solace or some sense of peace or comfortability with what's making them uncomfortable, right? Now, from a sociological perspective, or if you're looking at it from a social setting, the same type of internal process that a person goes through when they experience that dissonance cognitively, they express it externally as well. So, in other words, the self-talk that they may be having, trying to justify some shit that they saying and doing, they may do that and say that shit to you. And I'm sure some of you've experienced that before. You point out something, exactly what it is, but they're going to give you a whole bunch of reasons why it's not that. Oh, that might have been his cousin, girl. You know he got girl cousins. No, that wasn't even him because he said that he was over here. You know, ways to justify what is conflicting with their belief system, because again, sometimes when a person is indoctrinated and they have that sense of religiosity, all they have is that belief system. So they hold on to that with their last dying breath. So that leads into the second type of reaction that you get out of people. They will fight you about that shit. Some people will try to minimize it. Oh, no, it ain't even that. This, that, and the third. And try to, you know, shift that over to the side. Others will fight you about it. If you say anything against what they believe, right? So those are two different reactions that you get out of people who are experiencing cognitive dissonance from a social context. The third thing that people do is they just try to clown it. All of these reactions are a way to make themselves comfortable with the shit that they just been exposed to. They're going to trivialize it, they're going to fight it, or they're going to clown it. The last thing that people do, which is always the last thing, is they respond to it in a healthy way. So you expose something to them and it conflicts with their belief system or how they see things. It's uncomfortable for them, but they strive to embrace it and strive to adjust their behavior in order to align with this new information that they've been presented with. That's always the last thing that happens. And it is a response because it requires thought and getting your attitude in order. All of the other three things that I mentioned are reactions to cognitive dissonance. People react. Some people go through all of those three different reactions. They'll trivialize it, they'll fight it, then they try to clown the shit. And then maybe a year later, maybe days later, maybe weeks later, they will come to the point where now they're more receptive and they're responding to this and they're accepting of it. You know? It's important to understand this because as you gain knowledge of who you are and you have more experiences, these type of engagements with people become much more frequent. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating. Because here it is, you're dealing with people that, and it's hard sometimes for you to comprehend how they're not looking at something that is right in front of their face. It's in the visible, but they acting like the shit is invisible. It's in the visible. It's right there. But again, they know that the rain, hail, snows, and also hears thunder above their heads, but do not try to learn who is causing all this to happen by letting the 5% teach them. So that is a little caveat that's important to understand as well. Letting you teach them. So sometimes you may be so excited about something you've learned and you want to share it with somebody, but you trespassing against people. They don't want to know nothing about that shit because that's how they see it. And they have a right to see it that way. You have a right to see it that way. We just have to be able to respect the boundaries that people set for themselves. Because sometimes people are really afraid of heights. And I'm saying that because knowledge is also a compound word. It's knowing the ledge, like I mentioned before in one of our classes. And when you expose people to things or they start to become aware of something, that shit is frightening to some people because you've exposed their ledge. Some people don't like looking over that ledge. They feel like they're going to fall over the edge.